I still remember that night, the fairy lights twinkling across the backyard, the cake sitting untouched, and my daughter's hopeful smile slowly fading as each minute passed. We'd spent weeks preparing her graduation celebration, her first big moment after years of hard work. I'd sent the invitations, reminded the family, even cooked my late mother's favorite casserole, just to make it feel like old times. But as the evening went on, I realized no one was coming. Not a single soul from our family showed up. Not my sister, not my cousins, not even my own brother who promised he'd be there. My daughter tried to hide her disappointment, but I saw it in her eyes, that quiet heartbreak you can't put into words. I told myself people get busy, but deep down I knew they didn't forget us. They chose to stay away. I remember that week so clearly, the way the air smelled like cut grass and lilacs, the way the evening stretched out, soft and warm, as if the whole world was in bloom for my daughter. Sarah had just finished her degree, the first in our family to do so, and I wanted to give her something special. Not something expensive or grand, just a night to remind her that hard work, kindness, and love still meant something in this world. A small backyard party, lights, food, family, laughter. That was all I wanted. I'd been planning it for weeks. I cleaned the porch, scrubbed the old picnic tables until they shone again, and borrowed extra folding chairs from the community center. I even took out the box of string lights we'd used at her high school graduation years ago. Half of them flickered, but they still worked fine. I baked her favorite lemon cookies, made potato salad from scratch, and set up a little table with framed photos of her growing up. First day of school, her first violin recital. That summer she volunteered at the animal shelter. Every photo told a story. Every story was a reminder of what we'd built together, just the two of us, for most of her life. Sarah kept laughing, saying, "Mom, it doesn't have to be perfect." But I wanted it to be. She'd worked so hard to get here. Through late nights, student loans, part-time jobs, she deserved a night that felt like love made visible. The invitations went out a month early. I texted everyone myself, my sister, my two brothers, their kids, a few cousins who lived nearby. I didn't ask for much. I just said, "Come celebrate Sarah's big day." It would mean the world to her. Some of them sent polite thumbs-up emojis. Others said they'd tried to make it. I knew how families were. Busy, distracted, caught up in their own worlds. But I thought, surely this time, they'd show up. The day of the party arrived clear and bright. I spent the morning cooking and decorating, tying ribbons to the chairs, humming along to the radio while Sarah helped set the tables. She looked beautiful. Hair pulled back, that same sparkle in her eyes she had when she was little. Around 5 o'clock, we lit the candles and set out the food. Everything looked just right. And then, we waited. At first, I thought maybe they were running late. Traffic or last-minute errands. Things happen. I kept glancing toward the driveway, expecting to see headlights pulling up. But time kept moving. 6 o'clock, 7. The fairy lights came on automatically as the sun dipped below the trees, turning the yard golden for a moment before the shadows took over. Still no one. Sarah kept her voice light, too light. "Maybe Aunt Judy's just late," she said, scrolling her phone. "You know how she gets." But I could see it in her eyes, that flicker of hope fighting its last breath. She checked her messages, refreshing every few minutes, then quietly put the phone down. "No one texted, huh?" she asked. I shook my head, smiling the kind of smile you give when your heart's starting to crack. A few of Sarah's classmates did come by, 2 girls she studied with. They brought a card, and hugged her tight, stayed for a slice of cake, and left before it got dark. After they drove off, the sound of their car faded into nothing but crickets. We sat there under the string lights, the food untouched, the lemonade sweating in its pitcher. I remember thinking how loud silence can be. Every empty chair felt like a conversation that never happened, a memory that wouldn't be made. The soft breeze made the napkins flutter, and for a strange moment it felt like even the air was trying to comfort us. Sarah leaned back in her chair, looking up at the lights. "It's okay, Mom," she said, almost in a whisper. "We'll just eat together." So we did. 2 plates, a table meant for 20. We talked about small things, her job search, her plans for the fall, the stray cat that kept sneaking into the yard. But beneath her calm, I could hear it, that quiet hurt that only a daughter can hide for her mother's sake. And I knew deep down that this wasn't about a missed party. It was about years of being the ones who always showed up, for people who never did. When the night ended, I started cleaning up, but Sarah stopped me. "Leave it," she said. "Let's just sit here a little longer." The two of us stayed outside, watching the lights sway gently in the wind. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You know," she said softly, "I think this is my favorite kind of night, just us." I wanted to believe her. I really did, but there was a sadness in her smile that broke me a little. I'd spent my whole life trying to hold our family together. Birthdays, reunions, holidays, always the one cooking, calling, forgiving, and still, when it mattered most, they couldn't even send a text. When she finally went inside, I stayed a while longer. I looked at the chairs, all those empty seats glowing under the fairy lights. They looked almost beautiful, in their stillness. I thought about every time I defended my family to Sarah, told her they cared, they just didn't show it well. But maybe the truth wasn't that simple. Maybe they didn't care enough to show up at all. I gathered a few plates, covered the leftovers, and blew out the candles. As the last flame went out, I felt something inside me shift. Not anger, not yet, just clarity. For the first time, I saw the difference between family by blood and family by love. The next morning, the yard looked like a memory. Balloons half deflated, chairs lined up like a row of ghosts. The grass was damp with dew, and a few paper cups had tipped over in the wind. I started cleaning up, but I didn't feel sad anymore. Just tired, the kind of tired that comes from years of trying too hard. I found one of Sarah's cards sitting on the table, signed by her friends. It said, "To the kindest girl we know, thank you for always believing in people." I smiled, because that was her. Her father's heart, my patience, and her own quiet strength. I packed away the decorations, folded the chairs, and unplugged the lights. But before I stored them, I paused. I ran my fingers along the wire, those same old lights I'd used for every family gathering. For years they'd been a symbol of togetherness, but now they felt like something else, a reminder that not everyone deserves to sit at your table. Sarah came out later with a cup of coffee, her hair messy, her eyes soft. "You don't have to do all this right now," she said. I smiled. "No, honey, I do, because it's time." She didn't ask what I meant, and I didn't explain, but she nodded as if she somehow understood. We spent the rest of the morning quietly, side by side, packing away the pieces of a night that never really happened. I caught her watching me once, studying my face the way daughters do, when they sense something's changing. I knew she saw it, the calm that had settled in. The end of something old. Later that day, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window. My phone buzzed with a few late, "sorry, couldn't make it" texts. I stared at them for a moment, then turned the phone face down. I'd spent so many years chasing people who never met me halfway. But sitting there, with sunlight spilling across the table and the faint sound of Sarah humming in the kitchen, I realized I didn't feel small anymore. I felt free. That night, I called Sarah into the living room. We sat together on the couch, and I told her something I'd never said out loud before. "You know, sweetie, I think we've been trying too hard to make people care. Maybe it's time we stop." She didn't say anything at first, just nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. "I think you're right," she whispered, and that was it. No grand speech, no tears. Just understanding. The kind that sits quietly between two people who've seen enough to know better. That night, as I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I caught one last glimpse of the backyard through the window. The chairs were gone, the tables cleaned up, but the faint outline of where everything had been still marked the grass, a quiet reminder of what was lost and what was found. I didn't know it then, but that empty yard was the beginning of something new, a different kind of strength, the kind that doesn't chase people down to be seen, the kind that waits steady and sure, knowing someday they'll see what they walked away from. And when they did, I was ready. The morning after Sarah's party felt quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that doesn't fill a room. It hollows it out. The decorations were gone, the yard was clean, but something inside me stayed unsettled. I told myself it was just disappointment, that it would pass, like all small hurts do. But deep down I knew it wasn't small. It was something heavier, something I'd been ignoring for years. A few days later, my phone started lighting up, little pings breaking the silence I'd been trying to keep. At first I thought maybe someone was finally reaching out to apologize, but when I looked, it was just excuses. "We couldn't make it. Traffic was crazy. You should have sent another reminder, we forgot. Oh no, we thought it was next week." And then the worst one, silence, followed by a heart emoji. Just a tiny red heart, sitting there like it was supposed to make everything okay. I didn't respond. I didn't even type a word. I just set the phone down on the table and stared at it for a long time. After years of being the one who always reached out, who called, who checked in, who sent Christmas cards and thinking of you, notes, that's all I got. A heart emoji. I made myself some coffee and sat by the window, watching the wind move through the lilac bushes. It was funny, really. I'd spent my whole life keeping the peace, smoothing over family arguments, remembering birthdays, hosting dinners. I used to tell Sarah, family doesn't stay together on its own. Someone has to hold the strings. I believed that. I lived by it. But now, sitting there with my phone still buzzing, I realized that all those strings were tied to me, and no one else had been holding their end for a very long time. Sarah noticed something in me that week. She'd come home from errands and find me quieter than usual, slower in my movements, thoughtful in a way that even I couldn't explain. She'd ask, "Mom, are you okay?" And I'd smile and say, "Of course, honey, just tired." But it wasn't tiredness. It was clarity, a kind of calm that comes when you stop expecting people to be who they've already shown they're not. A few days later, when Sister Judy called, her voice had that same bright, practiced cheerfulness. It always did, the kind that meant she wanted something. "Mary Ellen, oh my goodness, I heard Sarah graduated. I'm so sorry we couldn't leave. Things were just hectic." I didn't say much. I just listened. She went on about how her husband had a work trip, how the kids had sports, how time just slipped away. I made small sounds of agreement, polite little nods in my voice, and then she laughed, actually laughed, and said, "You know how it is. Life gets crazy. Anyway, I saw the pictures on Facebook. The setup looked adorable. You always go all out." That's when something inside me finally settled. For years, I'd thought that if I just tried a little harder, if I was patient enough, forgiving enough, people would come around. But hearing her voice that day, all I could think was how easy it was for them to forget us, and how hard I'd worked to keep remembering them. After that call, I didn't reach out again. I stopped sending reminders, stopped checking if they'd received the birthday cards. I didn't cut anyone off. I just stopped chasing them. There's a difference, and somehow that difference felt like freedom. Sarah, on the other hand, was blossoming. A few months after the party, she landed her first real job, a nursing position at the local hospital. I could tell she was proud but nervous. I made her favorite dinner that night, roasted chicken and mashed potatoes, and we sat at the table laughing about little things. She said, "Mom, I think I finally get it, why you never let anyone stop you. You just keep going." I smiled at her and said, "That's what mothers do. We keep going." But even as I said it, I knew something was changing. The "we" in that sentence didn't mean the same thing anymore. For the first time, I wasn't going to keep going for everyone else, just for us. In the weeks that followed, life felt softer. The house was quieter but not lonely. I started spending mornings in the garden again, pruning roses, letting the radio play in the background. Sarah was working long hours, but she always called during her breaks, telling me about her patients and the stories she was learning from them. Listening to her talk, I realized she'd inherited something from me, that calm patience, that quiet strength. Then, one Sunday morning, just as the kettle started to whistle, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. I thought it might be another one of those calls, the kind that sound polite but come with expectations. But something told me to pick up. It was Gary, my older brother. His voice was unfamiliar at first, the kind of tone people use when they're easing into a request. "Hey, Mary Ellen, long time no talk. How are you and Sarah?" I told him we were doing fine, that Sarah had started her new job. He congratulated her, said he was proud, even though I knew he hadn't spoken to her in years. Then he hesitated, clearing his throat in that way. People do when they're trying to sound casual. "So, I hate to ask, but we've been having a little trouble. Business has been slow. You know how things go." "Then, well, I was wondering if you might be able to help us out for a bit." There it was. I didn't answer right away. I let his words hang there, drifting between us. He started to fill the silence, talking faster now, explaining how it wouldn't be much, how he'd pay me back soon, how it was just until things turned around. I looked out the window at the garden, the morning light spilling over the roses, the same ones Sarah and I planted together years ago, and I thought about how those flowers never bloomed the same way twice, but they always came back stronger after the frost. I said softly, "I'll think about it, Gary." He sounded relieved, almost cheerful. "Thanks, sis. I knew I could count on you." But as I hung up the phone, I knew he couldn't. Not anymore. I sat there a long time after that call, the tea cooling beside me. I wasn't angry, just still. For years I'd been the family's anchor, the one everyone leaned on when things got rough, the one they called when they needed something fixed, funded, or forgiven. And every time I helped, I thought it was love. But that morning I realized it wasn't love. It was habit. Love shows up. It doesn't make excuses. When Sarah came home later that day, I told her about the call. She frowned and said, "You're not thinking about helping him, are you?" I smiled and said, "Not in the way he thinks." She laughed, but there was a curious look in her eyes, like she could tell I was thinking ahead, quietly, patiently. Because I was, that night, after she went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad. I started writing down names, dates, little memories, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. I was connecting the dots between all the times I'd been the one to give, to fix, to hold things together while everyone else just took. And for the first time, I didn't feel hurt about it. I just felt awake. I think that's when the shift truly began. It wasn't about revenge yet. It wasn't even about fairness. It was about finally seeing people for who they were, and deciding what I would do with that truth. As I blew out the candle on the table and headed to bed, the house was still again. But it wasn't that hollow quiet anymore. It was a peaceful kind of silence, the kind that comes when you stop waiting for an apology that's never coming. I didn't know it yet, but that phone call, that one simple ask, was just the beginning. Because the next time the phone rang, it wasn't Gary, it was someone else. And that call changed everything. The first call came on a gray Tuesday, the kind of morning that made the house feel quieter than usual. I was watering the ferns when the phone buzzed on the counter. Gary's name lit the screen. 8 months had passed since we'd last spoken. 8 months since my daughter's party had been an afterthought to everyone else. And my heart did a small, careful flip at the sight of his number. Part of me hoped it might be nothing more than small talk, a brother checking in. Instead, his voice was the same familiar drawl, warm in a way that always put people at ease. But there was an edge to it that I didn't like. "Hey, Mary Ellen," he said. "How are you and Sarah? I'd heard she got that job. Congrats to you both." I told him thank you, that she was settling in and learning the ropes. He made a few polite noises, and then, like so many of his calls, he steered the conversation toward someone else's trouble. "Listen," he said, throat clearing, "I hate to ask, but we could use a favor. My boy, you know Tyler, he's starting up a little business. He's got a good idea, just needs a small family loan to get the equipment. I wouldn't ask if it weren't important." I could feel my hands go still in the sink. Tyler was the same nephew who hadn't once offered to help with the lawn at Mom's house, the same one who'd borrowed tools and never returned them. The voice on the phone was delicate and careful, the way people try to soften the weight of their requests. "How much are we talking?" I asked, because it felt proper to ask, though I already had a sense of what was coming. "Oh, nothing huge," he said, quick to put it in small terms. "A few thousand, tops. I mean, it's an investment, right? He'll pay you back, we'll make sure of it." He rambled on, filling silence with reasons and promises. I listened the way you listen to a radio in the background, the words fading into one another. When he finally paused, I said, "I'll think about it, Gary." "Thanks, sis," he said, relief in his voice. "I knew I could count on you." After I hung up, I stood for a while by the window, watching a leaf tumble along the driveway. It wasn't anger I felt, exactly. It was a clear, bright kind of disappointment that seemed more honest than any hot fury. For years, I had been the one who reached into the pockets of my patients and pulled out whatever was needed, money for car repairs, a down payment here, a tuition payment there. It had become a kind of reflex, a role I played without thinking, because I wanted to be the person my family could depend on. But tonight, listening to Gary, I realized something else. When it came to being present for the things that mattered to my daughter, they had not been dependable. When it came to asking for help, their memory was excellent. They were quick to remember my number when their problems needed fixing. They were slow, and often silent, when birthdays, graduations, and small celebrations were happening in our yard. The calls didn't stop with Gary. Over the next few weeks, my phone became a kind of revolving door. A niece reached out about tuition, a cousin called about a leaky roof, an aunt asked if I could help with medical bills for someone 2 states away. Each voice had the same rhythm: pleasant opener, quick update of troubles, and the eventual inevitable ask. It wasn't always money. Sometimes it was favors, connections, small emergencies, but the tone was always the same, and the timing was almost surgical. They never asked when they had been the ones to offer support, only when their hand was out. I started noticing the pattern more clearly. The texts and calls were different now, less about catching up, more transactional. Could you help us? Would you loan this? We'd appreciate anything. There was a practice in their politeness, as if they had rehearsed it. If you couldn't tell by the words, you could tell by how they used my time. Phone calls during dinner, voicemail messages dropped late at night, conversations that started like family and finished as business. And there was something else too, a quiet expectation. They didn't wait for an answer. They expected I would say yes. When I told Sarah about the calls, casually, over coffee, she just lifted an eyebrow and said, "Didn't you learn anything from the party, Mom?" I looked at her and saw how grown-up she was becoming. She watched the empty chairs with me. She felt the silence. She had not been bitter about it. She'd simply been honest in her disappointment. "I did," I said. "But habit is a stronger thing than a lesson sometimes." She smiled, small and understanding. "You don't have to be their bank, Mom." Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table with a pad of paper and a pen. I began to list names, not as a ledger of debts, but as a record of patterns. Each name carried a memory, a birthday I'd remembered for them, a casserole I'd dropped off when someone was sick, a Christmas I'd organized. Page after page filled with small kindnesses I'd offered without thinking, and under each one the current of thought, what did they do in return? For most the answer was nothing. This was not about money. I wanted to make sure that was clear. Money could be gained back, respect could not. Over the years, the money had become a currency of goodwill I assumed existed. I had taken their taking for granted. But tonight, putting pen to paper, I was noting the shape of the truth. I was seeing that some people treat generosity like a service to be used, and then set aside like an empty cup. In the days that followed, requests continued to come in. Each one was a small test of my resolve. I listened politely, I asked questions, I made sympathetic noises. I answered the same way I always had. I'll see what I can do, or I'll think about it. But quiet action had replaced my old impulse. I didn't rush to the bank or open the checkbook. I put notes in a folder labeled Consider. Not yes, not yet. I began to take care of myself in ways I had postponed. When my dentist called to remind me of an appointment I'd been postponing, I scheduled it without hesitation. I spent an afternoon at the library reading, because they were practical, but because they were mine. I planted new bulbs in the garden and watched the soil close gently around them. The small routines of my life felt like acts of reclamation. Sometimes in the quiet hours, doubts tried to creep in. I had helped people. Had I been selfish to stop? Would someone suffer because I wasn't the first to respond? The old voice inside me, the one that equated love with sacrifice, would whisper these questions like a plea. But then I'd remember Sarah's eyes that night under the lights, patient, hopeful, and then settling into a silent acceptance. I thought of the way the chairs had looked like ghosts, only when they were empty, and how they had shone like nothing at all when people who cared actually sat down. When Gary called again, a different tone colored his words. He sounded surprised I hadn't immediately offered to help, and a little wounded that I might hesitate. "I thought family was family," he said, which was both an appeal and a rebuke. I could have reminded him of the chairs, of the empty yard, of the plates cooling on the table, but words like that have a way of sharpening into knives in certain ears. Instead, I said gently, "Family means many things to many people, Gary. Being family also means being there, in ways that don't have a ledger attached." He cleared his throat. "I understand," he said, slower now. "Well, if you change your mind, let me know." Sometimes the silence that follows a conversation says more than the conversation itself. I sat with that silence, and it felt like a mirror. I could see how I had been used to keeping everyone afloat while quietly sinking. The realization didn't come with triumph or with malice. It came with the steady patience of someone who finally understands the terms of the bargain they had been operating under. I didn't cut anyone off. I didn't send angry letters or orchestrate some grand reveal. That was never my style. Instead, I started saying no with a calmness that surprised me. "I'm sorry, I can't help with that right now. I'd love to, but my resources are tied up. I have to be careful with what I can commit to." Simple sentences said without apology, and they landed like stones in places that had long been comfortable nests. The requests slowed, or at least they changed. A few relatives were startled into shame and offered clumsy apologies. "We should have been there. I'm sorry about the other night. Some tried to persuade to remind me of favors I had done, like those are supposed to be IOUs. I listened, and I acknowledged, but the decision had been made before their words had reached me. I wanted to preserve my capacity to care for Sarah and for myself. I wanted to be someone who gave from abundance, not from a ragged edge. One evening, after a particularly long string of calls, Sarah came home and found me sorting through a stack of our old family albums. She sat down beside me and we turned the pages together, small faces and faded photos, birthdays and Christmas poses smiling back at us. She paused at a picture of her younger self, grinning with a missing tooth. "You always made the best parties, Mom," she said. I smiled, and for a second a memory of laughter filled the room. Then she looked at me with that same clear gaze of hers and said, "You did everything for everyone for so long. Maybe now you get to do things for yourself, and for me." Her voice was soft, but it landed steady. I felt a warmth then, not the kind that comes from cake in an oven, but something like peace, the peace of a decision made and kept. The world didn't change overnight. Family dynamics are stubborn things, rounded and familiar, like river stones. But the tilt of my life had altered. I was no longer the automatic go-to for every crisis. I had become the person who considered her replies, who weighed not only who asked, but what they asked and what it said about who they were when it mattered most. Soon enough, the pattern of the asking would lead me to plans I hadn't yet imagined, to paperwork and quiet meetings and decisions that would surprise them all. But for now the change lived in small refusals, and in a steadiness that came from choosing where my generosity would land. I felt lighter in ways I hadn't expected, as if the air itself were easier to breathe when I was no longer trying to carry 10 people at once. The calls still came from time to time, but I answered with a voice that had learned to protect a different kind of care, one that would, in time, give back in ways that mattered, not to them, but to the daughter who sat with me under the lights, and learned a lesson she never deserved to learn in the first place. It was a quiet morning when the idea first came to me, not as a flash of inspiration, but as something soft and familiar, like a memory that had been waiting patiently for me to notice it again. The coffee pot was sputtering, Sarah had already left for work, and the house felt calm. I was sorting through some old documents when I came across a yellowing envelope with my husband's handwriting on it, the kind of careful cursive you don't see much anymore. It was an old investment summary, dated nearly 30 years back, just a small savings fund he'd opened when Sarah was still little. I remembered him mentioning it once, calling it our safety net. He'd said, "Someday this will grow into something that can do good, even if it's not for us." Back then, I didn't think much of it. We were young, working hard, counting every dollar. But now, seeing the numbers printed neatly on the page, I realized just how quietly that little nest egg had grown. It wasn't a fortune, not by any stretch, but it was enough to mean something, enough to matter. I sat there for a while just holding the paper. My husband had been gone for almost 10 years, but it felt like he was speaking to me again. Not through words, but through the kind of foresight that only comes from love. He'd built that fund, not for himself, but for us, and maybe for something bigger. That's when the thought took root. I didn't want revenge, not the loud, messy kind anyway. I wanted something that would outlast the excuses, the disappointments, the empty chairs. I wanted to turn what they'd overlooked, what they thought was just kindness they could drain dry, into something untouchable. That afternoon, I drove into town. The sky was overcast, but in that Kansas kind of way that still feels warm, where the light seems to hum instead of shine. I stopped by the local law office, a small brick building with a faded sign that still read, "Benson and Moore, Attorneys at Law." Mr. Benson had been around since before Sarah was born. He looked up from his desk when I walked in and smiled in that familiar, steady way of his. "Mary Ellen," he said, standing up, "it's been a while. What brings you in?" I sat down, folded my hands neatly, and said, "I need to make sure something lasts longer than I do." He gave me that look, the kind you give a person when you're trying to read between the lines. But he didn't ask right away. He knew better than that. I explained that I had a small savings fund, one that had matured, and I wanted to set up a trust. Not for my family, not directly, for something that would carry my husband's name and maybe my daughter's spirit into the world long after I was gone. As we talked, the plan began to take shape in my mind. I didn't want the money sitting idle, gathering dust or waiting for relatives to come knocking again. I wanted it to grow roots, real ones, in the kind of ground where good things could bloom. When I left the lawyer's office, I called Sarah from the car. "Mom," she answered, her voice tired but cheerful. I was thinking, I said, do you remember that little piece of land by the river? The one that went up for sale last spring? The one with the old oak trees? She asked, that's the one. She hesitated. You're not thinking of buying it, are you? I might be, I said softly. Not for me, for something else. There was a pause, then that curious tone she always gets when she knows I'm up to something. What are you planning? Something your father would have been proud of. That evening, I spread out the papers on the dining room table, the investment summary, a few bank statements, and a notepad, where I began to write ideas. The numbers weren't enormous, but they were enough to buy a modest piece of land and start something. Maybe a small community space, maybe scholarships for local kids, maybe a program for young mothers who needed a second chance. I didn't know exactly what form it would take yet, but I knew one thing for sure. It would bear a name my family had long forgotten how to say with respect, mine. But over the next few weeks I kept my plans close. Family still called, still asked for favors. Gary rang me up about his son's business loan, saying, we're just waiting on your decision, sis. Tyler's counting on you. I smiled into the phone and said, I haven't forgotten. My niece texted about her tuition. I told her, I'll see what I can do. A cousin left a voicemail about their roof repairs. You've always been such a blessing, Mary Ellen. You're the rock of this family. I listened, nodded, and wrote down none of it, because by then I wasn't their rock anymore. I was the ground they'd walked on too long, and I was learning how to pull back, quietly, without fanfare, until they no longer noticed I wasn't beneath them anymore. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, everything was moving into place. I met with a real estate agent, a young woman named Clara, sharp as a tack, and kind in the way you can tell she means it. She took me to see the property by the river one sunny afternoon. The air smelled of pine and clean soil. The land wasn't perfect, a bit uneven, a few patches of wild grass, but it felt right. You could do a lot with this, Clara said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. It's quiet, private, close to town. You thinking of building? Not a house, I said, a purpose. She looked at me curiously, then smiled. That's the best kind of project. When I got home, I made another call, this time to the community foundation downtown. They ran local programs, helped families in need, funded scholarships and housing projects. I told them I wanted to set up something under my husband's name, something that would quietly help people who worked hard but had been overlooked, just like Sarah and me had been. The woman on the line sounded moved. We can absolutely do that, she said. Would you like it to be anonymous? I smiled. No, I said. I want it to have a name. The Collins Fund, for Education and Dignity. It sounded right. In the weeks that followed, I signed papers, transferred funds, and filed documents. It was all done legally, quietly, beautifully. While the family thought I was simply considering their requests, I was building something lasting, something they'd never be able to touch, claim, or ruin. There was a strange joy in the secrecy of it, not spiteful, not cruel, just satisfying, like watching the roots of a garden take hold beneath the soil, while everyone else only sees the dirt. Gary called again one night. Any update on that help we talked about? Oh, Gary, I said kindly. I've been looking into a few things, just trying to make sure my money's going somewhere it'll do some real good. He chuckled, not catching the double meaning. That's why I came to you. You've always been the responsible one. I smiled, looking out at the moonlight on the river. That's what they say. After the call ended, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the porch. The air was cool and the cicadas were humming. I thought about how many times I'd been guilted into helping others, how many times I'd been told I was so good for doing it. It had always been a compliment wrapped around expectation, but this time I was doing good on my own terms. Sarah didn't know every detail, not yet, but she sensed something. One evening she came home to find me reading through contracts, glasses low on my nose. Mom, she said, amused, you've been on the phone with lawyers more than the family lately. What's going on? I looked up and smiled. Just making sure the right people get taken care of. She narrowed her eyes playfully. You're not talking about Uncle Gary, are you? Not this time, I said softly. She laughed, shaking her head. You're up to something. Maybe I am. By late summer, everything was in motion. The property transfer was nearly complete. The foundation paperwork was filed, and the small savings account that had once been a family safety net was now protected under something bigger, something untouchable. It wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about reclaiming the meaning of giving, about turning what they had treated as entitlement into legacy. And as I looked out at the evening sky, painted gold and rose, I realized something. The peace I felt wasn't just from doing something clever, it was from knowing I had finally shifted the story. I wasn't the giver who got taken for granted anymore. I was the architect of something that would outlive the noise, the neediness, and the excuses. They still called sometimes, and I still answered with the same warmth, the same politeness. But underneath every conversation, I held the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had learned that real kindness doesn't have to come at the cost of self-respect. They thought I was still the same Mary Ellen, dependable, soft-spoken, endlessly forgiving. But this time I wasn't just listening, I was building. The idea came to me one afternoon while I was folding laundry, simple as that. I wasn't thinking about revenge or teaching anyone a lesson. I was thinking about closure, about how sometimes the only way to end a long chapter of hurt is to turn the page yourself. It had been months since Gary's last call, and in that time I'd finished everything. The papers signed, the land purchased, the trust set up. The Collins Fund was official now, named for Sarah and built in honor of her father. It would support first-generation college students in our county, kids who'd worked hard but didn't have family cheering them on. It wasn't grand, but it was honest. It was something good born out of what had once been painful. I wanted to tell them in person, not out of pride, but out of peace. I didn't want rumors or phone calls later. I wanted to say my piece, clearly, calmly, once. So I called everyone, Gary, my nieces, cousins, even the ones who'd ignored me for years. I told them I was planning a dinner. I said, there's something important I want to share. It's about money. That word, money, does funny things to people. Within hours, my phone was lighting up with replies. We'll be there. Wouldn't miss it. What time should we come? It didn't surprise me, not really. But what did surprise me was how easy it was to smile as I read them. For once I didn't feel dread. I felt ready. The night of the dinner, I arrived early. The restaurant was small and warm, one of those old family places where the lights are soft and the tables still smell faintly of polish and garlic bread. The owner, who'd known me for years, set us up in the back room. Long table, white tablecloth, small vase of daisies. It was simple but elegant in its own way. I remember standing for a moment just looking at the table, the glasses lined up, napkins folded, and thinking how different this felt from Sarah's birthday party months ago. That night had been all empty chairs and fading light. Tonight, every seat would be full. Funny how that works. By 7 o'clock they started trickling in. Smiles, hugs, the kind of polite warmth that never quite touches the eyes. Gary came with his wife, Judy, both dressed a little too formally, like they were attending an award ceremony. My niece Megan came with her fiancé, chatting loudly, making sure everyone noticed her. Cousins, nephews, even my brother's son from 2 towns over, they all came. Some I hadn't heard from in 5-6 years. Every single one of them showed up. Full house, Gary said as he sat down, grinning. Looks like you got the whole family together, Mary Ellen. Must be something big, huh? I smiled. It is. We ordered food, and the room buzzed with small talk. Stories about vacations, new jobs, old gossip. I listened quietly, nodding when needed, smiling where it fit. I could feel the undercurrent, though, that hum of curiosity, the kind that always swells before an announcement. I didn't rush it. I wanted them comfortable first. I wanted the contrast to be clear. When the main courses arrived, I stood up slowly. My hands weren't shaking, my heart wasn't racing. I felt steady, the way you do when you've already made peace with the truth. First, I said, smiling gently, I want to thank all of you for coming. I know we haven't always been close, but tonight I wanted to share some news that's been a long time coming. They'd all quieted down, forks pausing midair. Even Gary looked up, attentive, his face caught between curiosity and expectation. For years, I continued, I've tried to take care of this family, in small ways, sometimes big ones. I've loaned when I could, helped when I could, and prayed for you what I couldn't do either. It's what family does, or at least, what I thought family did. A few faces shifted uncomfortably. I could see Judy glance toward Gary, then back at her plate. But somewhere along the way, I went on, I realized something. Family doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. Some people see it as love, loyalty, showing up. Others see it as convenience. The silence that followed was deep, but I didn't let it linger too long. I smiled again, not sharp, just calm. Now I know many of you have asked me for help over the years, and I don't regret helping. Not once. But recently I made a decision, one I think you all deserve to hear directly from me. I reached into my purse and took out a small envelope, the kind with embossed lettering. You all remember the savings fund my husband started years ago, the one people always assumed I'd share someday. There were nods around the table, a few murmurs of agreement. Gary leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. Well, I said, I finally did something with it. The room leaned forward almost in unison. I opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a copy of the trust document, neatly folded. I used that fund, I said clearly, to establish the Collins Family Trust, named after my husband and dedicated to supporting first-generation college students in this county. Every penny of it will go toward helping kids who work hard but have no one to help them. The first scholarships start this fall. The air in the room changed. The sound of forks and glasses disappeared completely. I could feel the stillness settle like fog. Gary's wife was the first to speak, her voice thin. Wait, you mean it's gone? The money? Not gone, I said gently. It's just finally gone where it was meant to go. Gary muttered something under his breath, then said louder, So after all these years you give it away, to strangers? You could have helped family. You could have helped your own blood. I met his eyes. Family loyalty, I said softly, is what I was hoping to see that night. He blinked, thrown off. What night? The night of Sarah's birthday, I said. The night we waited, the night no one showed up. No one spoke. Gary's mouth opened slightly as if he wanted to argue, but nothing came out. Judy lowered her gaze. My niece Megan looked down at her hands. The room was still except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan above us. I didn't need to raise my voice. The silence did the work for me. After a moment I smiled again, not triumphantly, not cruelly, but with the kind of peace that only comes when you finally stop trying to fix what was never broken on your end. This trust, I said quietly, isn't revenge. It's redemption. It's making sure that the help I give goes to people who will never forget what it means to be remembered. Someone cleared their throat. Gary leaned back in his chair, eyes hard. You're saying we don't deserve it. I looked at him for a long moment, then said, I'm saying you had your chance to show up, and when you didn't, I finally learned to show up for myself. He didn't answer. No one did. I sat back down slowly, folded my napkin in my lap, and took a sip of water. The tension in the air was thick enough to touch, but I didn't feel trapped in it. For once I felt free inside it, like I'd stepped out of a weight I'd been carrying for years. The waitress came by a few minutes later, nervous, asking if anyone wanted dessert. No one spoke, so I smiled and said, I'll take a slice of lemon pie, please. She brought it over quietly. The room stayed hushed. I ate it slowly, enjoying every bite. By the time the plates were cleared, most of them were already standing. Some muttered quick goodbyes, others left in stiff silence. Gary paused before leaving, standing beside me with that same half-smile he'd used all his life, the one that said, You'll come around eventually. Big statement you made. Tonight, he said. I wasn't trying to make a statement, I said, folding my napkin. I was making peace. He didn't know what to say to that. He just nodded once and walked out. When they were all gone, I sat for a few minutes longer in that little restaurant, the empty chairs around me, the quiet hum of the lights overhead. It looked almost identical to that night in my backyard, except this time the emptiness didn't ache. It soothed. I paid the bill, thanked the waitress, and stepped outside into the cool night air. The stars were faint behind a thin veil of cloud, but they were there. I thought about my husband, about Sarah, about how sometimes the only way to teach people the value of showing up is to stop waiting for them to. I got in my car and drove home in silence, the road lit by soft pools of light from the street lamps. When I pulled into my driveway, Sarah's car was there. She was waiting up, reading on the porch with a blanket over her lap. She looked up when she saw me and smiled. How'd it go? I smiled back. Peaceful, I said. She tilted her head. Peaceful good or peaceful final? Both, I said softly. I walked up the steps, kissed her on the forehead, and sat beside her. The night was quiet except for the crickets. For the first time in a long time, I felt like my heart wasn't stretched thin between what I gave and what I lost. It was full, quietly, completely full. And though I didn't say it aloud, I knew my husband would have been proud. Because I hadn't just protected our money. I had protected our meaning. When I got home that night, the house was quiet. The porch light glowed softly against the autumn air, and I could see Sarah through the kitchen window, her silhouette moving gently as she set something on the table. When I opened the door, the smell hit me first. Vanilla, and something sweet. There she was, standing by the counter with a small cake in front of her, 2 candles, flickering on top. The words written in careful frosting said, "Just us, surprise," she said, smiling. I figured we could use our own kind of celebration. For a moment I just looked at her, my daughter all grown now with her father's quiet steadiness in my stubborn heart. The same girl who sat beside me under string lights months ago, waiting for people who never showed. The same girl who had wiped her tears that night and told me, "It's okay, Mom," but somehow it was now. I set down my purse, took off my jacket, and walked over to her. The lights in the kitchen were soft, warm, the kind that make everything look a little more like memory. We sat down together, just the 2 of us, same as before. She poured tea, cut 2 slices, and handed me the first one. The frosting was uneven, the cake a little lopsided, but it might have been the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. "You didn't have to do this," I said, though my voice betrayed how much it meant. She grinned. "Maybe not, but I wanted to. I thought, maybe it's time we make new memories around cake and chairs." I laughed. Not the polite kind, but the deep, quiet laugh that comes from someplace true. It felt good, like air after rain. The kitchen clock ticked softly in the background. The world outside felt still, peaceful. For a long moment we just ate in silence. Not the awkward kind, the kind that feels full, like everything that needed to be said already had been. And maybe that was true. Eventually Sarah leaned back in her chair, looking at me with that same curiosity she had when she was little. "So," she said, "how did they take the news?" I smiled faintly. "About as well as you'd expect." She laughed softly. "That bad, Let's just say the silence afterward was enlightening." We both smiled, sharing the kind of understanding that only 2 people who've lived through disappointment together can share. It wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't even sadness. It was something gentler, acceptance maybe, or peace. After we finished the cake, I stood and walked over to the wall near the bookshelf. Hanging there, in a simple wooden frame, was the new plaque from the Community Foundation. I'd picked it up earlier that week. It read, "The Sarah May Foundation for First-Generation Students, established in honor of dedication, resilience, and love." The gold lettering shimmered faintly in the lamplight. Sarah followed my gaze and stood beside me, her hand brushing mine. "You didn't have to name it after me," she said quietly. "I didn't have to," I said, "but I wanted to." She smiled, eyes glistening a little. "Dad would have liked that." "I think so too." We stood there for a moment just looking at it, the way some people look at old photographs or keepsakes. Except this wasn't about remembering what had been lost. It was about what had finally been made right. "They ghosted her party," I said softly, half to myself. "But they'll never escape her name." Sarah looked at me, smiling through tears. "You know, I used to think that night would always hurt to remember," she said. "But now, I think it's one of my favorites." "Why's that?" I asked. "Because it's when I realized how much you loved me, and how much I wanted to be like you someday. There are moments in life where words fall short, and that was one of them." I didn't answer right away. I just reached over, squeezed her hand, and said, "You already are." Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees. The moonlight spilled through the curtains, soft and silver. The same chairs from her birthday party still sat out back under the porch light, the ones we couldn't bring ourselves to throw away. They weren't empty anymore. They were reminders, symbols of what we'd learned. Family isn't who fills your house on your happiest days. It's who stands beside you when the house is quiet. When there's nothing left to say, give nothing left to gain. It's who stays. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to keep connections alive, mailing cards, hosting dinners, offering help. I thought about how I used to equate love with endurance, and how somehow letting go had finally felt more loving than holding on. We cleaned up together after that, humming softly to the old radio playing in the corner. Sarah insisted on washing the dishes while I dried. It was such a small, ordinary thing, but it felt like a celebration all its own. When we finished, I poured myself one last cup of tea and sat down at the kitchen table. Sarah curled up on the couch, scrolling through her phone, a soft smile still playing on her lips. I looked around the room, the flickering candles, the framed plaque, the faint sound of laughter echoing from a memory. And I realized something. Peace doesn't always come as an ending. Sometimes it arrives quietly in the middle of an ordinary night, in the warmth of a kitchen light, in the sound of someone you love breathing softly nearby. That was my celebration. Not revenge, not victory, just stillness. the kind that settles in your bones when you finally stop fighting to be understood and start living in the truth you've built for yourself. Later, before heading to bed, I stepped outside for a moment. The night air was cool and the stars were out, scattered like silver dust. I looked up, whispering a small thank you to my husband, to the years that shaped me, even to the pain that taught me patience. When I came back inside, Sarah had dozed off on the couch, the plate with crumbs from her slice of cake still beside her. I pulled a blanket over her and turned off the light. For a moment I stood there in the dark, just listening to the sound of her breathing, steady, peaceful, alive. That sound was worth more than any inheritance, any approval, any apology that might still be waiting somewhere out there. I smiled to myself and whispered, "We did it, honey. We found our peace." And as I walked down the hallway, I caught a final glimpse of the plaque glimmering in the moonlight, her name glowing faintly in gold, like it was meant to shine. They might forget the parties, the dinners, the favors, and the years I spent holding everyone else together, but they would never erase what came from that silence. Because in the end, I didn't win by getting even. I won by making something beautiful out of what they left behind. I won by choosing legacy over bitterness. And as I turned off the porch light, I knew that was enough. Because justice, the quiet kind, the lasting kind, doesn't always look like payback. Sometimes it just looks like peace. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you believe that kindness, even in pain, can build something beautiful, subscribe to Quiet Justice for more stories like this one.